So hello, good morning or good afternoon and evening, depending when you're listening. I'm Charlotte Cagnier from Birth Essence, and today we're lucky to have Debs Neiger, who is an independent midwife with the Yorkshire Storks, who's going to chat to us with birth today. So welcome, Debs. And I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit more about how you became an independent midwife and how your passion to support women started. You've gone silent, the sound has gone. Oh, it's back again when you spoke then.
Okay. So
Yeah,
I've
it's
been
back
in
now.
midwife for about 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I have worked in the NHS for some years of that, the first few years of that, about 3, I think. I enjoyed it in some ways and I didn't enjoy it in many other ways. Mostly time constraints, policy constraints, all the constraints that most NHS midwives find difficult. I think I struggled with a lot. I then had my first baby with independent midwives, which sort of went down like a lead balloon in the unit I was working in, if you can imagine. And my independent midwife then asked me whether I might fancy working with her. That had always been sort of something in the back of my mind because I'm originally German, and in Germany many midwives also do independent work on the side, much more commonly than here. So I always sort of fancied that way of working, but I didn't really see a way for me to, sorry, my voice is still going from this laryngitis thing. Didn't really see a way to make that feasible for me, viable money-wise, and actually it's still not particularly viable money-wise. But I thought, well, why not? I wasn't going to work all that much on maternity leave anyway, so I started working independently when my son was he was probably about 5 weeks old.
Sorry.
We can just do that. Tag teaming each other on the challenges. So I then started working, like I just said, about 5 weeks, when he was about 5 weeks old. I only did sort of antenatal and postnatal visiting because I could take him with me, and that worked really well, and I wasn't working a whole lot. And then over the years that increased. And basically I just wanted to be able to work the way that my midwife had worked, which was she had all the time in the world. She came to my house, she listened to me, she didn't tell me what to do, she didn't roll her eyes at any of my choices, she didn't judge me, she didn't do any of the stuff I would have an issue with. She was there for my birth, she didn't interfere, she just sat and watched me and offered reassurance if I needed it, and then she let me get on with it, which is what I wanted. And then she also was there for me postnatally, which I thought as a midwife I wouldn't need all that much postnatal care because that was the easy bit. Probably I was focused on the birth, as most women are. But then she really sort of helped me postnatally because I didn't find it all that easy to have a baby, and I didn't find breastfeeding easy, and it was hard, and I hadn't quite anticipated that. So that came as a surprise. But that really made me realize that postnatal care is invaluable. And again, in the NHS, I couldn't provide that care. I couldn't sit with someone for hours while they tried to breastfeed. I couldn't visit them a lot. I mean, that was 16 years ago, and postnatal visiting was still more, it was happening more than it does now. In many trusts now it's clinic visits. There might be one home visit, there might be no home visits. They're generally only 3 visits, if at all. and to me, even then, it wasn't enough. So yeah, that's how I came to independent work, and I've sort of done independent work ever since then. Sometimes more, sometimes less when I had a baby. I did do it in combination with NHS work as well for about maybe a year, which was very interesting. I only went back to the NHS because I had to pay my maternity leave off. So I did the minimum amount of numbers that I could get away with. And that was a nice way of realizing that I should just go fully independent. And that's what I did after a fairly short amount of time. So yeah, that's how I came to independent midwifery, I suppose.
So I'd love to know more about your birth story. You chose to go with the Yorkshire Stocks. Was it the Yorkshire Stocks you had your baby with as well that you now work for? Yeah.
Working with my own midwife. So
oh wow.
Midwife, but yeah. So still working on seeing her on a almost daily basis, which is really nice. And she's seen my child. It's been great. I hope for her. I
So what was it like for you giving birth, and tell me a bit about your story.
So I didn't want anything specific from my birth. I wanted to be at home, and I didn't want to be messed about with. One of the overriding things for me was that I didn't want an epidural because I'd had lumbar punctures as a child. And I remember them as horribly traumatic, being held down, and I could still feel that needle in my back, and that was not an option. So much of my wanting to birth at home, or a bit of my wanting to birth at home, came from that. But also I just wanted a normal birth without any faff and mess and messing and being disturbed, and because I truly believe that that's how birth for most women works best. So that's what I did. I was very lucky because there's always an element of luck involved in that. I had very straightforward births both times. First time around was longer than the second, as is very usual, but it was very textbook, sort of a slow start. It was interesting because I had my mum over from Germany, who foolishly, when I was very early in my pregnancy, I thought I could maybe present some sort of healing experience for her because she had a really, really traumatic birth with me and an emergency section. That story of that birth was always told to me very dramatically when I was younger, and there was lots of trauma attached to it. It was very obvious. So in early pregnancy, I thought, oh, it'd be wonderful, although I didn't have a very good relationship with my mum, really. But foolishly, triggered by some sort of weird pregnancy hormone combination, I invited her, and then of course the flights were booked and she was going to stay in our house, and so she was present when I went into labour. But I had known before that really that I probably wouldn't be able to tolerate her near me while I was labouring. So my body waited until I heard her door snap into the lock for her to go to sleep at night. And then I started having really regular contractions overnight, and I snuck around because I didn't want to wake her up, and I wanted to wait until she was definitely asleep. And then I sort of slowly laboured through the night. Called my midwife out just after midnight, I think. And then just things increased from there. I was still really aware that I didn't want to wake anybody up. So thankfully I was a quiet labourer, so I didn't make particularly lots of noise or anything. And then I remember I was starting to feel really expulsive, sort of definitely around the time when my mum would have normally woken up. So I definitely couldn't push my baby out until I knew that someone had told her to not come downstairs, because I was birthing. And they kept saying, oh, she won't come in, she won't come in, it'll be fine, we can't hear her yet. And I was like, no, someone needs to go and tell her, because I need to know that you've done that so that I can then have my baby in peace. And then as soon as someone had done that, I then had my baby after that, which was interesting. So yeah, it was a really straightforward, lovely birth. I have no negative memories at all. It was just, I was in awe of myself afterwards. It totally changed my perception of myself. it was so interesting because I was hardly a midwife. So I basically labored with my fingers up my fanny. That's just what I did, because it was just the most interesting thing to feel all the changes that were happening. Yeah, it was just so cool to see it from the other side, because from the midwife side a lot, and then seeing it in the way that I saw it then was entirely different and so exciting. So yeah, that was good. It was really great. I was very lucky in that I had the best support I could possibly have wanted, and my body cooperated nicely. So yeah.
I love to hear the stories when women feel they're transformed afterwards, or in awe, and like, especially when you already knew so much about birth because of being a midwife, and then even though you already knew more, like, to actually experience it. I love that.
Yeah, pretty wondrous. So yeah.
Yeah. And then you had another child in a similar way. Did it transform you again more, even though you'd already done it once? Did it have an impact again?
Yeah, it was very different. Just it was very fast. And plus I didn't have my mum there. Very calculatedly this time, did not invite her, which was a little awkward. But yeah, it was very different. My waters went before I went into labour, which was a surprise. I hadn't expected that at all. And then I went to bed and then woke up in full labour and just had a baby very quickly after that. Basically, my husband just about made it downstairs. My son was 4.5 at the time. He was supposed to be there, so he woke up just before. His job, we had sort of given him a job so that he could be busy and involved during the birth, and it was to feed me snacks or get me drinks. But by the time that I woke up, I was already transitional and having a baby, essentially. My midwife was on the way and just about made it by 5 minutes. He was feeding me those snacks.
I was just saying, when you said that, I've got an impression of how my toddler feeds me snacks. Here you go. No, I don't want it, thank you. No, here you go. Here you go. You'd be like, ah.
So we, yeah, I think I did manage the smoothie, but
I've got this impression of a really diligent young child with like an array of snacks.
So he did have, so we did have an understanding that, oh yeah, Mummy does look a little bit busy, so maybe I should just maybe hold back with the snacks.
It's really sweet though. It sounds really lovely.
And again, it was straightforward with no issues. So again, yeah, my body cooperated, and I was lucky in that way. And yeah, same midwife, who was by that point a colleague and a friend, which was just incredibly lovely. My son knew it really well because he was always with me when I was working, because he wasn't in childcare, so he had been to all the study days, to all the meetings, so they were really familiar with each other. So it was, yeah, it was good. It was a really good. My husband knew her incredibly well, so it was a very intimate sort of affair, which was, yeah, was great. No strangers. Thank you.
It's lovely. I love to hear it, like the transformation, because I think when birth goes well, women always feel strong afterwards, from the sense of achievement. No matter how, when I say goes well, I mean it can go differently to plan, but feeling that they've done it in the end, that they've maybe made the choices, felt in control, felt respected, and then at the end, you know, you've done all that, then it can be really.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's definitely got the power to transform positively and negatively, unfortunately. But it doesn't really matter necessarily, in my experience, what the clinical picture of the birth is necessarily, but it just matters that you are heard, respected, have your choices acknowledged, and followed through, and then.
I like in yours that when the waters broke, because of all your knowledge, you weren't panicked, you just went to bed, right? You know, like, your water broke, you went to bed, and then, you know, because a lot of people get worried by things that are slightly different from the textbook, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, they do. But
so I love that as an example for people to listen to, you know. It's just...
Yeah. I also, an interesting snippet, I did break my own waters with my first birth. There's people, I was like, oh, you did an ARM on yourself, and B, why would you do that? But I had a definite sense of a hold up, and I felt like it was definitely my waters holding this baby in. I had no urge to push, and that had been probably 2 hours with a bulging bag of waters, and I thought if that just went, I could just push this baby out. So I just broke myself and pushed the baby out promptly after that. So yeah. But that's what women probably do and used to do when they were fully able to tune into their own body and follow their own needs. It's not like I willingly broke my own waters because I fancied having a baby anytime soon. It felt like that was what needed to be done. So,
yeah, that came first. You weren't thinking about it in advance. The impulsion came to do it, and then you go, oh. It's like, yeah, I know what you mean. With my second, there were things I did that just came like that you can't plan. It was as it was happening, because he was coming fast, and I felt myself tear inside slightly, because I said, I need to slow it down. I started talking to him to slow it down, and it did slow down, and it was really interesting, all the different things that I did, like panting. I just started doing that, but like listening to my body and just going with it like that. And that's what I'd love women to have more confidence to remember, that skill, to trust themselves.
Yeah, but we're very good at eroding that trust slowly with in lots of different ways, from lots of different directions, and it's really, really, really hard to reinstate that, I guess. So, that's a big job doing that.
Yeah, one of the things that I hear a lot of women worry over is when to call the midwife, when to go into the hospital. What do you recommend to women or suggest to help them feel confident about that?
I always say that you might get it wrong, and that's okay. You know, because there's no hard and fast rule to it. I know that lots of midwives will tell women certain numbers, and I've heard lots of variants in those numbers, and I don't even repeat any of the numbers because they're always different. So I usually don't give numbers, because those numbers can really backfire. I've just attended too many labors where you know, either women have been contracting very frequently for a very long time, and really that was not established labor yet, and they were totally fine with that. And then I've also attended births where women have only been contracting once every 10 minutes and they still had a baby, funnily enough. So I'm not a fan of numbers generally. So I usually say to women, you might get it wrong, and that's okay. It's really hard to judge it, particularly if you've had a first labor that was one way, and then you're about to go into your next labor, because it probably is going to be a lot shorter, but it might not be. You just don't know for sure what is going to happen. So I usually just say to women that they need to just go with their guts, and not necessarily always the women, but also the people that are with those women. So you know, partners, friends. So if there's a definite change either in the frequency or strength of contractions, or there is a definite change in the behavior of the person having the baby, then it might, depending on the change of behavior, then it might well be time to call the midwife. And, you know, the midwife comes, or you go to the midwife, whichever. I mean, I normally come to people to attend their birth, and time alone still, and you know, how do you feel about me leaving for a bit again? I can always come back again, and that's not a disaster. That is totally fine. I do know that in the NHS that is a little bit more difficult to achieve because they might not be quite as flexible as that, but it's an option. And what else was I going to say? Yeah, so you can go with your gut, and if your gut didn't quite get it right, then nothing lost really, except for a bit of a disruption in the process, which that's not to be sniffed at, because that's really important as well, particularly if you have to go to the midwife.
Yeah,
that could actually really disrupt that sort of very fragile early labor, because early labor is really fragile for some women, or easily disrupted. So it's worth having an awareness of that. And if you get it wrong and the baby arrives before the midwife, well, then it does, and that's okay as well most of the time. And you know, we have good emergency service in this country generally, who generally prioritize birth very well, although they're not the ideal people to attend your birth. If it's just a bridging attendance until a midwife can get to you, if you want a midwife, then that's totally fine. So yeah, I think people are worried about getting it wrong, and I think they think midwives can tell them something that makes them get it right, and we just can't. I will not have the arrogance to say I can judge labour stages over the phone very well. I can't. Sometimes it's very obvious, of course, but sometimes it's like, what do you reckon? And women are generally pretty good at estimating when they need someone. And if they feel they need someone, they need someone.
Yeah, that's the other thing, isn't it? If with the way the system is, it's all about coming only in when they're ready and overstaffed, overstretched, all that. Whereas like having you, for example, if they need you and you come and it's early, I think sometimes that's less of a disruption because you've come to them. And then if you say, oh, it's early, but everything's good, everything's fine, you're doing great, then it's more of a reassurance than a disruption. You can go away again and they go, well, I've been checked by the midwife. The partner's going, oh, she's been checked by the midwife. Everything's fine. Everyone relaxes. And then they can call you out again. I think that's the ideal kind of situation where it can be reassuring just to have someone, especially the first time, to someone to say, yep, you're all doing fine. You're okay.
Yeah. I have women often that are fairly far away from me, so it's not unusual for me to travel an hour and a half or so to women. And sometimes women are nervous about the distance, and sometimes I'm a bit nervous about the distance because I know that sometimes birth happens quickly. I've definitely I've definitely attended women where they just needed to know that I was closer. Then they were able to
relax.
let labour. And oftentimes then I would go into the home, say hello, check the woman if she wanted any checks doing, although oftentimes that's just the chat and maybe listen to the baby. And then I might go away again, but stay around the area, so just go to a cafe or a pub, or obviously not to drink, but just to have I remember sitting in Asda supermarket cafe for a while because they have got really good Wi-Fi and it's cheap. So, and then being called back when things seem more imminent. And yeah, so sometimes women just need the reassurance that you will come when they call you, and that you are a little bit closer, and then they're going to have a baby.
Well, I love that. I think it's really great to hear that you can't get it wrong, because people get really fixated on the numbers and am I getting it right? So I think it's really great if people can take that on board. And what I love, you mentioned checking the baby, and I know because I read in an interview that you use a fetoscope, which I'd never heard of. And I used, in my third, we used is it Pinar? Is that how you say it? Yeah, so I really loved doing that. And I did that in my third one because I had an independent midwife as well. And we started off initially using the more standard sort of Doppler, and so that my husband and I could hear it, but he didn't like it. And every time he would just kick the midwife. It was really noticeable. We did it about 2 or 3 times in the initial appointments, and he would just like kick like this. I don't think he likes it. He really could tell. So we stopped doing that. We used the peanut afterwards, and she would listen in. She'd let my husband have a go at listening in, so it was really good fun. And we took a picture of that to show his mum, which I'm guessing his mum, my husband's mum, is from the Gambia. He's from the Gambia, and she's one of the women that gets called out to check on, like, they're all in the compound where they live. All the women will do their own, support. The older women will support, but if there's a difficulty, she will be called to some of the other compounds, and then if there was a real difficulty, then it would be a hospital, but generally mostly it's in the compounds. So she probably has something like that. I don't know, because it's women's business over there, so I don't actually know anything. But he got to do that, like to be like a midwife kind of thing, listening in to the baby. So he loved that. I couldn't listen in, but I really enjoyed that. He liked it then. So I knew we were still being checked with the heart rate, but it wasn't with the gel and the ultrasound thing. So that was really cool. And I think people don't even know that's a possibility nowadays, because we're so used to the technology here. So I'd love to hear about your fetoscoping, which I didn't even know what it was.
Yeah, so I should have, it's in my car.
That's okay.
The stethoscope is like a stethoscope, but it's got a special attachment at the front that looks a little bit like a pinard, I suppose. And it does the same thing as a pinard does. It listens to the baby without ultrasound, sort of in a stethoscope way, I suppose. And in fact, you can actually use a stethoscope to listen to babies as well. But it's a little bit more, it's a bit easier to pick it up with a fetoscope. And it's got the earpieces, so that with a pinard, only the person who's not pregnant can listen to the baby, because you can't reach your ear to the pinard. That doesn't work. But with a fetoscope, you can actually listen through that earpiece, because it's got attachment to use. So you can find a spot on your belly, put the fetoscope on it, and then just like with the stethoscope, listen to it. So I often use it all the way through pregnancy. I mean, when I say all the way through pregnancy, generally, from 28 weeks, it's relatively reliable to listen with it, depending on the mother's build. But yeah, it's a really great tool to have, because many of my clients don't particularly want ultrasound, and they really appreciate still listening to the baby.
That's what I'm thinking. It sounds so intimate to hear the baby, and you can't hear it out loud in the room, but you're kind of hearing it more internally. I didn't know they existed, so I until I saw your article, and I really loved the sound of them.
Yeah,
really great.
I think we forget that with both the pinard and the fetoscope, it also can tell us other things. So it can be used, for example, to determine more clearly the baby's position, which can be really clinically relevant, because actually you can't really do that very well with the Doppler. And we're losing the skill a little bit to use it for those other things they can help us with as well. And that's a shame, because I've had lots of student midwives come out with me who have never used the pinard, who were desperate to learn because they'd seen it and they wanted to know how to do it, and they wanted to have the tricks and the what to look for, how to do it. And their midwives just hadn't really had the time to teach them, because they don't use them routinely anymore. It's really nice to see that there's some pockets where midwives in the NHS are still using fetoscopes, and they're pinards, because they really should do. But yeah, I've seen a lot of students come through who just never had the opportunity to learn. But pinard versus fetoscope, fetoscopes are very American. And I have no idea why they're not more popular in this country, because they're just so great. They
sound quite similar, except for the earpieces. In like they work in a similar way, do they?
Yeah, they
like
do.
Listening directly to the baby.
Exactly. So I don't.
And they're non-invasive in, completely just listening.
Yeah, ultimately a pinard with an earpiece attached, so women can hear their babies, or pregnant their babies. So I don't see the downsides, and I just don't know why.
It's one of the rare occurrences. It's probably libelous or something, but it's one of the rare occurrences where America has something that I think that I think is something they could export out rather than exporting the rest of their medical system out to the world. Yeah.
On American websites to be sent here. I think Cascade is like a birth supply service in the US, and I think they send to the UK for not too much money. So they're definitely available.
Yeah.
To buy. It might just be a little bit extra on postage, but you know, I think it's totally worth it.
Yeah, it's lovely. I missed listening into the baby, but I was happy not to, because he clearly didn't like it, and I wanted to, as much, for me personally, I wanted it to be as undisturbed as possible and as sort of in tune and intuitive as possible. I didn't have any scans. I didn't even have bloods done, and it was the third child, and I didn't really need to know anything from there. After a big discussion with my midwife, and of course on the NHS, that might have raised a few eyebrows. No scans, no bloods, no nothing. How do we know when you're pregnant, or if you're pregnant, and when you're going to give birth? How do we know these things? I'm like, look at me, feel me. And my midwife, like you said, had the skills. She knew how big he was, where he was sitting, with the, you know, she knew where his heart was, everything. And that was like that human touch, the delight of my midwife, and just placing hands, and really, it was lovely, really beautiful experience all round, really. I had the best pregnancy with my third. She might listen to the interview, but I'll tell her. But I really had the best pregnancy, in part for that care and that touch and that kindness and that enthusiasm for me and the baby.
I guess if you can work in the way that you really would like to work as a midwife, then you're going to bring more enthusiasm and less stress to the home, I suppose. So yeah.
My NHS midwives were beautiful. Some of the ones I had, they had some of the enthusiasm. I just know it's so hard, like you said, to keep that when you're overstretched and overworked and haven't got the time you'd love to give. So that was why the contrast for me with and I know that, you know, not everybody has that option, and, you know, I'd love to see a big transformation, that everyone, even the NHS, could work the way they really wanted. And some of the examples that we had.
There's lots of super enthusiastic practitioners, but it's an uphill struggle, I think. I guess we're seeing a little bit of we're seeing a move towards continuity now, or at least we're trying to move. Which is heartening, and some trusts have really picked it up and run with it, and are doing a really brilliant job in setting up teams that are going to work that way. In some trusts it's not working quite as well for lots of different reasons, but I'm really interested to see how it's you know, where it's going to go, how it's going to work, but I hope that is going to give lots of NHS midwives a little bit of freedom to work in the way that most midwives probably would like to work, if it wasn't for some of the downsides that came with it. But yeah, so it'll be interesting.
Wonderful.
How it unfolds.
And I'd like to talk a little bit like sort of oxytocin and induction, because I know that like there's a huge sort of push for induction at the moment, and the stats that I saw in the recent articles were like 55% of certain, even in the younger groups, it was still very high percentage of induction, which is suggesting we're not really trusting women's bodies to give birth when they want to. And then the oxytocin, I know it didn't say in those stats what kind of induction they had, but once you get to the level of the drip with synthetic oxytocin, I think a lot of people think it's doing the same thing as your own natural, and I don't think that's the case. So what do you feel about induction and oxytocin?
Well, I'm horrified that half of women in this country seem to be unable, or seem to be deemed unable, to start their labors in a normal physiological way. That can't possibly be true, or I'm baffled by it, and it sort of snuck up on me a little bit, because I don't see it in my own practice. It's very, very, very rare that we have someone choosing induction, because essentially that's what it should be, for women to proactively choose induction rather than to be very proactively offered induction. And when I say offered, I mean the offer is not generally an offer that is easy to decline, even if the woman feels very strongly that she doesn't want to be induced. So yeah, it's interesting how these numbers have slowly crept up and up and up, and we're now at 50%. And we hear so many stories of women not being satisfied with their births. And oftentimes those births have been induced births. Not always, but often. And I think, and I don't really like to focus on numbers particularly, because I think that is quite difficult to do, because, in numbers should always be nuance as well, and it's difficult to bring in nuance if you look at just a set of numbers. But I just wish that women had an exhaustive and informative and evidence-based session with someone who is invested in having a happy woman after her birth, to explore what is important to the woman, what is she envisaging from her birth, what is particularly important to her, what is not so important to her, how does she feel, her, we often call it the risk profile. I don't really like talking about risk. I would rather talk about complexities or issues, so that she can then make an informed decision about what she would do once she approaches term or post-term. And that's what we usually do as independent midwives. We don't assume that women will be induced at, it's arbitrary between different trusts, isn't it? We have a local trust where induction is offered at term +7, then we have another neighbouring trust where it's, I think, term +12, and there's some trusts where it's still term +14, for some it's term +10. It just, it who knows?
It's really early. In France, it's 41 weeks is our 40 weeks, I think, there's term. So term +7 here for starting induction is really early.
I think I've known of one trust where it's term +5.
Wow.
Certainly, probably because maybe they had a cluster of adverse outcomes and it was a kickback policy change. That's often what happens, I think, with clusters of unusual events. So yeah, that's what I would like, and then I would like to see how the numbers for induction pan out after that. And yeah, like I say, that's what we generally do. We talk about the reasons why induction is offered, talk about NICE guidelines, we talk about the evidence, we talk about the different experience that might come with either physiological birth or with induced birth, the possible differences. We talk about the potential that induction can be swift and easy and completely uncomplicated, and won't bring up any complexities potentially. So, and then our clients tend to choose to not be induced. But I do realize we have a very self-selecting subgroup of pregnant people in our clientele, who probably chose us because they want a less interfered with pregnancy and birth. So that's part of the reason why we don't see induction very often. But that's not to say that our women won't choose induction if they feel that there's a good reason for it. And that certainly happened before, where a woman's tipping when it came to going post dates was reached, and she decided that she would go for induction. But equally, we also supported an almost 45-week pregnancy. And we happily do that without coercion and pressure, just with nuanced discussion, I suppose. So yeah, I would like to just see women have the choice and the option to discuss her choices without fear mongering. But then what is fear mongering to one person is just good evidence-based information to another. So it's hard to strike the balance. I do realize that. But it is possible to have good nuanced discussions with women about their choices and to then support them with the choices that they make. But it requires time, and time is something that often is at very short supply in the NHS, in a clinic. And that's a hard thing to navigate, I think, for midwives who don't have the time, because if you don't have
take time, and sometimes there's not that much evidence, is that right, for some of the things we do, including ultrasound that we take as standard now, there's not actually that much research being done in the first place to look at.
Yeah.
And even with inductions,
communicate that to women that actually we don't really know. And we have research saying one thing, but we also have pretty good research saying another thing, and those two things are in direct opposition. So, you know, where do we go from there, and how do we?
I think that's why it's so important to go back to trusting what the woman feels, because she ultimately will know whether that intervention or support that's being offered is the right one for her or not. She's ultimately the only one, because person A with exactly the same clinical, whatever you want to call it, and person B might make different choices for completely instinctive, and both of those choices will be right even though they're different, because you can't know logically what's going to happen, but maybe on some soul level or body level, your body and your baby knows what it needs. So that's what I feel anyway.
Yeah. Oh, you're frozen.
Yeah, you froze. I'm back now. Are you okay? Can I hear you?
Yeah, you're back with me now.
Okay, good. You're back now. Sometimes that happens. And do you find you have lots of women wanting VBAC?
I think
sorry, we might have crossed over there. Do you find you have lots of women wanting vaginal birth after cesarean, and that there are lots of myths for you to debunk there? Because I think I hear people being told they can't have vaginal birth after 2 cesareans, or even that they've had one, they've got to have another, and it would be best for their baby to have another without, again, like you said, an evidence-based discussion. So what kind of myths do you find yourself having to debunk for women wanting VBAC?
Again, I guess we don't have to debunk a whole lot of myths, because women are already, because they really want a VBAC and they know that they can have it, but they're not being well supported, or they fear that they are not going to be well supported, because generally for us it's going to be an HBAC rather than a VBAC. But all those myths are still coming up in discussion, because I guess women hold fears from what they hear being talked about, or what they have said, what healthcare professionals have said to them in previous experiences. But to us, it's very much well, I don't want to call it a non-issue, but in many ways it is, because we really would just support a woman as we would support any other woman during her birth. We might have some extra considerations for that woman that we discuss with her antenatally. So, you know, we might discuss a little bit more about monitoring and potential little warning flags that might crop up in labor. We might be a little bit more proactive in monitoring her pulse, perhaps. But ultimately, to us, with someone planning a VBAC at home, support for physiology is I guess, just as important as for anybody else. And if physiology is going to work, then it's going to work well, most likely. And if not, then we will have little warning flags popping up. Maybe her pulse is going to raise. Maybe she's going to tell us that she has pain between her surges, or maybe the woman tells us something just doesn't feel right, or maybe there's no perceived progress that makes us maybe offer a vaginal examination to see whether things are actually happening in the way that we think they seem to be happening. So yeah, while we have the element of a scarred uterus, the scary scarred uterus, in the back of our mind, it really doesn't change how we support someone in labour, particularly unless this woman has had particular requests about how she would like to be supported. So yes, it's something that we discuss antenatally and that we keep in the back of our minds, but it doesn't really change our support for the woman or what option she has. She has the same option as anybody else.
But I think it's really important what you're saying, and really sounds like a small thing, but it's actually really big, because ultimately every pregnancy, when they're all different, you're looking at the woman and giving her the best care in that circumstance. So it's no different for VBAC, HBAC, first time mother, and I think some of the evidence actually supports that. The outcomes of not being different, I think the evidence supports it. So you're putting the best physiological conditions, the best care, and you're trusting that woman, listening to her. And then, of course, in any labour, if there's a red flag, you act on that, and if there's not, you act on that and support that birth. So it's really, I don't know how to put it into words, but it seems to be like the opposite of treating a woman like a ticking time bomb, the opposite of that, like just completely trusting her. Doesn't matter what's gone before, that's like you taking those circumstances, maybe you're taking them into account, but ultimately underlying that is a trust in her and in birth and her body, and you're following what that's telling you at all times.
Oh, you've unfrozen yourself again. Yeah, I definitely would say I trust women to be able to trust themselves. Mm-hmm. I would never say that I trust birth. I respect birth. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think trust is definitely not something I would have for birth. And I know that that's not a particularly popular thing to hear for some birth workers. I have deep respect for birth, but just like I wouldn't trust, I would never trust nature to keep me safe. I know that nature has a tolerance for loss, and sometimes birth doesn't go well. And if I just trusted it and didn't listen to my gut instinct about what is happening in that particular birth, I would be really foolish, I think. You're frozen again.
Yeah, your video's disappeared. I think our internet's doing some funny things. I can hear you again now. I can see you again now.
Oh yeah, you have disappeared again. Oh, I can just put your name on the screen now rather than anything else.
No, I'll bring it back again.
Okay.
I think we're doing it right again now. Well, I think deep respect is it. I can feel that. It's good to have deep respect. I think we all have our own relationships, but deep respect is good. What would be your vision? I know we touched on this before, but what would be your vision for the future of birth if you could wave a magic wand? Future of birth and motherhood. You can have anything you want. What would be your vision?
I mean, honestly, I don't. What I would really like is for women to be respected in their full bodily autonomy. Yeah. And I would like for women to be enabled to make choices that feel absolutely right for them, rather than choices that others feel that they ought to make for their own bodies, babies, births, whatever. And I think if we start from the basis of that, then we're halfway there, I think. I do truly think that if we respect women I think we often see women when they are women or people, when they are pregnant, we see them in isolation of their pregnancy, and as someone who's got a baby inside of them, or 2 or 3 babies, and that doesn't really work, because
You're frozen a little bit. I'm just not sure. Could you repeat the last sentence?
I can just see your name on the screen again.
I can hear you well. Can you repeat the last sentence? You said that we treat women in isolation. We treat women in isolation when they've got babies inside, or pregnant people inside, and then you froze a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that treating them in isolation, of being a vessel for another human at that point, that doesn't work. That's never going to work, because experiences, and with lives they've led before, and with family circumstances, and with preferences, and with priorities, and with philosophies, and with all that other stuff that makes them a human, and if we don't see all that, or have the chance to get to know all that stuff about a woman or a person, then how could we possibly give her the care that she needs? We can't, and we don't often. So I think that's really, really, really important. So I like to know who my clients are. I mean, literally who they are, and how they see themselves, and what they like and what they don't like, and what's important to them, and what their previous experiences are, and all that stuff that takes time to find out. But also, I like for them to know about me, and know who I am, and so that we do have an actual relationship when it comes to them having their babies, and that's really, really important to me, and I think it's important to them as well. But it makes me a better midwife to be able to work, to happen, for there to be a respect for autonomy, b an understanding that a woman doesn't just come as a pregnant vessel. She is a person, and needs to have individualized care that works for her as a person. And I think the ideal is always going to be relationship-based midwifery, and that's what I like to have with my clients, and that's like for other women to also be able to experience. And lots of women do, but not all women do. So yeah.
Great, thank you. If there was just one thing from today that you'd like all women to take away to inspire them with confidence for their own birth experience, what would you like women to take away?
From this interview?
Yeah, just you froze again just temporarily. I wasn't sure if you were thinking of the reply or if it had just gone silent, because your face froze as well, although she's thinking really hard about this question. I don't know if I'll have time to edit it, but I
Do you
might,
mean
because I can sometimes
from
edit when it freezes. I think it's telling us the interview because it keeps freezing on us, and it didn't freeze all the beginning. But just essentially, if there was one lesson, like women to know, any, you know,
take
inspiration
away from this
thing,
interview?
yeah, like a takeaway from the interview, or from anything that, you know, you suddenly think, oh, I want to say that.
Well, again, I think it just comes back to this whole thing about bodily autonomy. That's just a really big underlying thing for me. I would like to have the courage to take charge of their own care, particularly if they're not able to access midwifery that works well for them. Tell their care providers exactly what they need and what they expect to get. And I think I certainly know when I worked in the NHS, having service users, I think we call people accessing the maternity care services now. When I call them clients, I know that doesn't sound good to lots of people. I think clients. I like to call my clients, but let's say service users. I always found it much easier when they told me exactly what they wanted. Thank you very much, and there was not much compromise in that, and that made it so much easier for me as a midwife to give them that, because I could just document so and so wishes XYZ, declines A and B, and then I was covered, because that is in the back of your mind as a midwife, that you do need to make sure that you practice safely. And I was covered in terms of not following trust guidelines, say. And I was evidencing giving, client-centered care, and that's all I can do as a midwife. I can't do something that a client is not consenting to. So the path of guideline and policy. So for women to know that, actually it often makes it easier for midwives to give them good care if they're very clear in what they need. To have the courage to say it, even it might sound a bit stroppy, so sometimes, but there's nothing wrong with being clear in what to work courage for. So, yeah.
Really great. Well, thank you. I think it's true. A lot of the summit's talking about finding our voices and using them. So definitely. So thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I hope people really enjoy listening to you. I think you've cut out a little bit again.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you now. It's telling us to stop.
All right, nice to talk to you.
Yeah, nice to talk to you. Thank you so much.